Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to talk about CLOSE, which is an interactive multimodal travel time map. And so throughout the talk, I'm just going to abbreviate that as walkability, even though I'm talking about access to amenities by walking, rolling, public transit, basically neighborhoods that don't force you into a car. And so I think a lot of us might sort of intuitively feel that walkable neighborhoods are better, but I want to put some sort of numbers and some facts behind that. So why walkable neighborhoods? First of all, you've got a lower greenhouse gas footprint. In the US, transportation is our single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the biggest things you can do is switch from driving a solo car to moving to public transit. Solo driving is the sort of #1 contributor in that transportation category. And you think about, biking and walking are close to zero carbon emissions. And so what you get is the sort of counterintuitive idea that neighborhoods that tend to be denser often have lower carbon emissions. So New York City, which we don't often think about as like an environmentalist paradise, has carbon emissions that are about a third lower than the US average. At the same time, we have higher qualities of life in walkable neighborhoods. So people who live in the most walkable neighborhoods self-rate their satisfaction with life as very high, twice as often as people who live in the least walkable neighborhoods. And after you adjust for things like wealth and age, you still find that people who live in walkable neighborhoods get outside more, they feel more connected to their neighbors, they're more politically engaged, and the list goes on. So correspondingly, people realize that walkability improves their livelihoods, and so people want to live in walkable neighborhoods. A recent survey found that 77% of adults would pay more to live in a walkable place. You can also ask the question a little differently and say, would you rather live in a smaller home in a more walkable neighborhood or a larger home in a car-centric neighborhood? And large majorities of millennials and Gen Z want to live in these walkable neighborhoods in smaller units. And that's also, there's sort of this inverted U-shape where people in the oldest age groups, the silent and greatest generations, there's a near majority of people who want to live, make that trade-off as well. And so you start to find that actually this is both a combination of many people want to live in walkable neighborhoods and many people cannot drive and so are forced to use other forms of transit. So there's a recent book published by Anna Zivarts called When Driving is Not an Option that found that about 30% of Americans live without a driver's license, and that is either because they are too young, they can't afford a car, or they have a disability that precludes driving. And so we can think about both these people who are sort of choice walkers and people who are forced to walk. And we, when we're thinking about building new neighborhoods and sort of making up for a housing shortage, we might want to consider all these factors and start to build sort of more walkable places. So I'm going to use Seattle as a touch point throughout this presentation. I originally developed this map for a Seattle context, and then it got sort of a positive response there, and so sort of expanded to the whole US. But like many cities that had a lot of development before the early 1950s, Seattle neighborhoods were sort of walkable by default or by necessity through most of the 20th century, or at least streetcar accessible. And even today, we find that Seattle has a pretty high walk score across the country. So it's listed as the 9th most walkable major city in the US, with a walk score of 74. But when you look at commuting surveys, people can often use things like public transit to get to work, but 3 out of 4 Seattleites said that they needed to use a car just to get around errands in their own neighborhood. So clearly there's this disconnect between the, the supposable walkable paradise that I'm living in and the actual experiences of a lot of Seattleites. And so I wanted to sort of think about, what's the method that I can use to sort of more accurately reflect your ability to get around a neighborhood not using a car. So in this, I'm in conversation with the idea of the 15-minute city, which became popular in the early 2020s as a response to COVID. The idea is that you should be able to, through active transport, get to most of the major amenities you'd need in your daily or weekly life. And also be able to get to public transit to take you elsewhere in the city. So I think there's a lot of questions about, is 15 minutes really the ideal threshold? Is this a new idea, or is it just, recycle Jane Jacobs? But it's an interesting sort of starting point. And through sort of like thinking about these concepts and also sort of like being in conversation with a bunch of different studies on walking and sort of public transit access, I sort of came up with these criteria for the map. So first of all, it starts with proximity to amenities. And so people will often say, well, what about, comfortable tree-lined streets that have really good safety features? And that's all great, but you're not going to get people out on the street unless the walk is useful. So there's all sort of evidence on this. And I think one of the most interesting is a study that looks at the correlation between green space and getting out. And the researchers thought that more green space would lead to more people walking outside. And they actually found that green space is concentrated in suburban neighborhoods, so fewer people are actually walking in greener streets. So proximity amenities is #1. Also, because we're thinking about proximity, that's going to vary by neighborhood within a city and also by block. So you can think about assigning things to like city level scores or neighborhood level scores, but you have to really be aware of and try to visualize that variation within those geographies. And then also, it's going to vary according to the individual, somebody's travel ability, their preferences, and their different amenities that are important to them. So I like to think about this over the life course. You have people who are in maybe their early 20s, and they want to have a lot of access to things like restaurants and nightlife and bars. And then you might have like a young family, and then things like childcare and schools are really important to be accessible. And then like later in life, you might want things like healthcare. And so throughout those, like you want to, really think about like this not being a single sort of number that is a one-size-fit-all sort of definition, but something where you can really toggle according to individual preference. And finally, for me, and I think this is where mine sort of differs from a lot of other metrics, my map is limited by the most distant important amenity. So you'll choose all the amenities that are important to you, and then it'll color the map according to what is the most distant of all of those. So I like to think about this as, I could be really close to 99 out of my 100 most important amenities, but if I'm not within like a 10-minute walk of a grocery store, I'm going to be getting in a car every week. So with this, I have tried to push the limits of PowerPoint, and we're going to try a live demo that is embedded in PowerPoint. I'm flying a little close to the sun, so I do have a backup if this doesn't work. But here we've got close.city. That's the sort of base URL, and I've got a bunch of shortcuts. So this is close.city/Tacoma. And here you can see we're sort of panning around the map, and each of these blocks is colored according to the distance to both a supermarket and a library. And here you can choose different modes of transit. So you can say walking, biking, or walk plus transit. Here we can also do sort of selections. So here we're looking at the combination or the sort of the overlay between those two. But we can say, what if we just care about supermarket distance? And then we get sort of a different restriction. So here, we're right around here, right in city center. And you can see that if these are the two amenities you care about, you start to be in a little bit more of a difficult position because you're pretty far from a supermarket. And I'll just click on this block here. So you see that you're 22 minutes from a supermarket, and as we all saw coming in, you're going to be walking straight up a steep hill to get to it. So we might start to sort of tailor our amenities to a specific life course or like a specific sort of user. So maybe we're thinking about a family with young children, and they want to sort of think about the amenities that are going to be most important in their life. So there's 35 different amenities you can choose from. So I'm going to say they want to be close to a park. They want to be close to not just a park, but one that also has playgrounds. And then also, we are going to really care about childcare, so preschools, and then eventually schools that offer kindergarten. So all these are options on the map, and you could see that as I was adding these different amenities, each of them is showing up in a different color. And you probably also saw that as we went, the tiles sort of narrowed in on a few different neighborhoods. And so you'll see that often these amenities appear in clusters, and that tends to be where you get these walkable areas. But you could imagine if you chose a different set of services, you might get a completely different map. So here we're just going to zoom in on the, on the north end. I guess I shouldn't scroll. There we go. And so we can start to ask questions like, what is the limiting factor? When this shows up in orange, what is the factor that would need to change to make this more walkable for a user who needs all of these amenities? And so you can see, hopefully, the advantage both from sort of like an individual perspective, like I want to move to an apartment that's near all these things, but also from a city planner perspective. If you can ask a normative question like, if people deserve access to all of these things by walking, or let's say you can walk to or bike to a park, biking or public transit, where are we not providing the services that people need? And here I just want to do a quick comparison. So this is available for every city in the country. So here, and I should say every city block in the country. So here we've got Manhattan, and this is a sort of classic, extremely dense, typically walk and transit heavy area. And so I'm just going to take off the amenities so we can see a bit better. And of course, as you would expect, population density is so much higher in sort of lower Manhattan that you have these really dense areas where you are less than 5 minutes from every single one of these amenities. I'll just zoom in a little bit here. Then at the same time, we could go somewhere like Los Angeles, which has a reputation of being not a particularly walkable city. And what we find, that was the wrong Los Angeles. There we go. And what we're going to find when this loads, you do see that it's there's a lot less blue on this map than there was in New York, but you'll still see these areas that do have this, light blue, which represents a travel time of less than 10 minutes. And so what you can find are that there are these sort of walkable pockets, even in places that are traditionally not considered like, walkable meccas. That includes, larger, more car-centric cities. It includes smaller like neighborhoods or sort of old town downtowns in small cities. And so we can also start to think about like an action plan that would start to build out these areas of walkability in hopefully an equitable but also sort of incremental way. So I just really quickly want to talk about my tech stack because this is all based on open data sources and open tools. So a lot of my amenity locations come from Overture Maps, which is a great new open data resource. Also for topic-specific sources, so a lot of the education comes from US Department of Education and a lot of user feedback. I should mention on this map here, if you ever want to report a location that's incorrect or missing, you can report a missing destination. Or if we zoom in a little bit and we can see locations again, you can report a location that is incorrect. So here I could click on this supermarket and say, actually, let me click the alert button to report that as incorrect. Then we've got about 8 million census blocks from the US Census. Those go into a travel time database of just amenities and blocks. But then, of course, we have the important part of going from every single block to the nearest location of each type. So we've got 35 different location types, 3 different modes of transit, so that's 105 attributes for each block. So we use road data from OpenStreetMap, public transit routes from this great mobility database, which has about 2,000 different traffic routes worldwide. And there's all sorts of different routing engines you can put in. I used R5, which is this great open library that accounts for things like traffic schedules, so you can do sort of scenario modeling throughout the day. It also accounts for things like road traffic stress for bikers and elevation change. And so there we get our travel times by block, all in a single spatial table. That goes to a GeoServer, which is my map tile server, and then that gets fed to the web map, which is based on open layers. So 2 things I'm a little proud of and just wanted to share some quick hacks. One was you'll probably notice that the labels and streets were above the choropleth map on the previous slide. And the reason for that is there's actually 2 different base tiles that are being used, served from Stadia Maps. So you've sort of got your like land features and water features, and then you've got roads and labels on top, which I think is just a lot better style. Also, GeoServer, for people who have used it, people will sort of remember that typically what you do is you sort of define the layer on GeoServer, and then it just gets served as a single option. But here we've got any 6 combinations of 105 different sort of attributes in a block, so that has to happen dynamically. And so what we do is I generate this style layered descriptor based on the buttons that a user has selected, and that just feeds back to GeoServer. So just wanted to quickly talk about the reactions. So I originally posted this on social media. First it was for Seattle, and then I built out the whole country. And it was pretty lucky that sort of picked up first on social media, then local news, then national news, and I've had about 4 million views since launch. And so I've gotten a lot of reactions from people just emailing or messaging me on social media. One was that this helped me find my next apartment or house, so really glad that this seems to be something that people actually do care about and can act on. And I actually just moved 2 weeks ago, and I used the map, and it did feel sort of like a life hack. But I didn't just hear about real estate. I heard all sorts of examples for people who are using this for specific kinds of advocacy. So people who cared about distance to a supermarket, distance to a large public park. And so this is also about, I hope that being able to break it out by amenity also helps people sort of figure out their specific use case and their specific goal here. A lot of people from small towns reached out saying, thank you for including this. Most of these rankings only include like the 100 largest US cities, and there are a lot of like walkable city centers in those smaller areas too. In fact, a lot of the power users are outside of like what we think of as like the largest walkable cities. So I was pretty pleased that seems to be having an effect too. And I just wanted to share one quick story from a social media user who was talking about how he had none of the amenities listed on this map. It was totally gray in all aspects. And then one coffee shop / bodega opened on the corner of his street, which was just a residential street. And he said it completely transformed the character of my neighborhood because suddenly I would go to the coffee shop every morning and I would see my neighbors and you would be like waving to people as they passed by. And suddenly what was sort of just this like, unfriendly, accumulation of houses became like a real sort of like social network. So it just sort of speaks to the power that, this walking has not just on, all those quality of life factors, but also on like the character of a place. Then the 2 questions I get most often are, can you add another destination type? It really depends. Some types are really well defined. Other types, like I think healthcare is really important, but I'm still trying to figure out how to get that right because your local family doctor or like OBGYN is very different from the tri-state trauma center. And so trying to figure that out is still somewhere where I'm still sort of working. And then when will you add Canada, Mexico, Europe, and everywhere else? And so also working on that. And so just quickly to say, there's all sorts of city extensions you can do. You can sort of make these normative statements about people should have access to this basic set of services. And then you can make sure that access is equitable across different socio-demographic groups and also sort of focusing on the places with the highest population density already. You can figure out if I had to add one new amenity or public service, where could I add it to maximize that bundle of goods across the city? So this is an example in Seattle, and I think you get something like 20,000 people who have access to this bundle with just a few changes. And you can also do interesting things like optimize public transit routes. You can think about transit as the ability of people to get to have a utility function that requires access to amenities and sort of maximizing that and access to jobs. So working from that premise rather than sort of more traditional like network planning. So then I'm hoping for more map features, including some quality of life things like being able to search particular addresses, being able to sort of like locate where you are at this moment. New destination types, like I mentioned, and also hopefully going to have a data API pretty soon so that people can sort of bulk download for their cities and do their analyses on top of it. Because there's all sorts of, because you're working with census blocks, there's all sorts of other sort of secondary analyses you can do related to equity and things like outcomes as well. So the last thought I wanted to share was about what is the purpose of this map? And I think from my perspective, a lot of, especially city officials, really like to use walkability as their sort of go-to. Everybody likes to walk, nobody's against it. It's sort of this squishy thing that you can just sort of gesture to. But this, being able to sort of like measure it, I think measurement facilitates management, and even more so, being able to put it on a map facilitates the conversation where you can say, you're pro-walkability, but the whole city is gray. Like, what are you doing to change that? And so I hope that this is sort of a starting point for these kinds of public policy conversations. So thank you so much. I'd love to take questions. Yes?
I'd love to hear you talk about how you manage like the user feedback with having so many views. Like, how do you verify if someone says, this doesn't exist or this is missing? Like, what is that process?
Yeah, it's really tricky. I do tend to sort of, most of them don't seem to be malicious, and it's usually, you can tell there's a cluster coming from a single place, and so I'll usually take that over like Google Maps. I do have a section in the form where it says like, can you provide sort of third-party verification that this doesn't exist? And what often happens is that like Overture was in alpha when I first started releasing the map, and now it's in beta, and so it's just that like their data sometimes tends to be like a little bit more out of date than Google Maps, and they can point to Google Maps says this is permanently closed. But yeah, it's definitely like a case-by-case basis. Thanks. Yes, in the back.
I'm wondering if you've had any safety considerations for this version, like traffic stress or street lighting and stuff like that, or if maybe you'll implement that in the next version.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think that's like the sort of obvious next step for walkability. It's like, it's useful, now is it safe? I think here the two biggest problems are, I guess the one biggest problem really is just data availability. My experience doing like consulting in Seattle area is like Seattle and King County and Pierce County have really good public data compared to the rest of the country. And even there, the sidewalk data is like a hot mess. And like a city and a county and the public data source will be like three different things. And so I think that's something that is definitely like, I'd like to do like on sort of like a city by city basis with people who have the data. And there's some really interesting work that's happening out of University of Washington where basically, I think the professor's name is Anat Caspi, and she's trying to basically automatically generate sidewalk and sidewalk quality data, which is something that like almost no city has, using Street View imagery. And so I think that would be a really interesting next thing to add. And then the other thing I'll say is that bikes, there's a level of traffic stress feature. And so the standard is like most people can ride on a level of traffic stress that's 2. And so that's set on the map, but I think there the issue is OpenStreetMap data, and just OpenStreetMap doesn't always have the greatest, like rich metadata to like figure that out correctly from. So that's definitely a limitation right now. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, like bike lanes, as far as walkability or bikeability, that's not built in for this.
So bike lanes they're a feature, but the thing is, my concern is that maybe there are too many different roadways that you can bike on, but in actuality, no one would safely want to bike on. And I think that's also, they're less available than the street network as well. I was told that was the last question actually, but I'd love to talk afterwards, so thank you.